Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Laura Dawson. I'm the director of the Canada Institute here at the Wilson Centre. And I am delighted to host some friends here, some old friends, to talk about this book, The Art of Diplomacy. So I met Bruce and Vicki Heyman in a hot, windowless room at the State Department in March of 2014. And many of you have some friends from State who know exactly the room from State Department that we were sitting in. And it was just one day, or maybe one day after your official swearing in. There was a bunch of Canada watchers who were stuffed in this room with Bruce and Vicki, and we were trying to give them the Coles notes, or as you call them in American, the Cliffs notes, on Diplomacy with Canada 101. And so we were talking about softwood lumber, and we were talking about NAFTA, we were talking about hogs and logs and culture and steel. But what we really were thinking is that this pair had to figure out a way to capture the hearts and minds of Canadians. And to do that, you have to talk about Canadian Tire money and Timbits and double-double and the fact that we know that the Leafs will never, ever win the Stanley Cup. And so from the very first, this pair was just brilliant at engaging with Canada. Because we Canadians, we're like hedgehogs, we're prickly at first, but you get inside and we can be kind of warm and cuddly. We're very likable after a while. And so Bruce and Vicki found a way to gain the hearts of Canadians, the friendship and the respect. They learned that Canadians can complain about snow in April, but visitors to Canada cannot complain about our snow, our weather. And they captured the hearts of Canadians by meeting them on their home turf, I think one Canadian at a time, every province, every territory. And they found that our common language, their way in to Canada, was through arts and culture. That doesn't mean that they didn't do important policy issues on borders, security, you name it. But really, it was through the lens, through the media of arts that not only did they win over Canada, but in fact, our cunning plan in Canada was to win them over as well. And since the past couple of years have been very turbulent in the relationship, Canadians have really appreciated, really cherished the fact that Canada has no more passionate and outspoken advocate for the importance of the relationship in the United States than these folks, and in particular, Bruce Heyman. As Bruce notes in this book, we are family no matter what, but the bond between us is fragile. And so they stand up for the relationship every day and remind us what's important. And plus, this is a great book. Not just because Bruce is a co-chair of the Canada Institute Board, not just because it's been in print for less than 10 days, already a bestseller on the Toronto Star bestseller list, not just because it mentions the Wilson Centre on page 245, although that's excellent, but also because it made me cry on page 64. I also used to work at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa before their time, and there's a beautiful picture of my favorite security guard who dressed up as Santa Claus every year and who passed away a couple of years ago. Not too many books on diplomacy, not too many books written by diplomats include a picture of the best security guard in the building. So that describes the heart of this pair. So before I start to cry again, we're going to turn it over to my boss. I'd like to introduce now Wilson Centre's President and CEO, Jane Harman, and she's going to welcome our moderator, Ben Rhodes, and kick off tonight's program. Jane, please.
So it's a full house, and our speakers deserve it, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone. Problem with Laura is she's so unenthusiastic. You don't know if she cares about the Canada Institute. She really doesn't care about anybody on the stage. Wonder, I've seen her. No, let me stop that, because her enthusiasm is infectious, and under her leadership since 2015, our Canada Institute has been surging. The programs, the board, The energy are inspiring, and I'm really so proud, Laura, to work with you. So let's give our friend Laura a hand. And for those of you who don't know it, our Canada Institute is the only program in Washington that focuses solely on the U.S.-Canada relationship. Therefore, it is the best program in Washington that focuses on the U.S.-Canada relationship. If you don't agree with that, leave the room. So, I'm delighted to introduce this panel and welcome back Ben. For those who don't know this, Ben sat outside the door to my current office. He had a desk from 2002, or I think he did, to 2007 as Lee Hamilton's speechwriter and assistant. When he did that, nobody knew who he was, except maybe for Lee Hamilton, my predecessor. Things have changed a bit since then. Our Ben went on to be President Obama's speechwriter and then Deputy National Security Advisor. He recently wrote a big New York Times best-selling memoir of his White House years. He's writing another book. And he also has moved to Venice, California, the best place to live in the world. And he also was on my television set this morning as I was on my treadmill. But Ben, in my view, let's roll back the videotape and remember where you started. Where was that, Ben?
Right outside your office.
Right outside my office door at the
Wilson Center.
Aha. So raise your hand if you think Ben owes everything to the Wilson Center. All right. We're also delighted to welcome the Heymans and to celebrate their service to Canada, their new book, and the fact that Bruce, as Laura mentioned, but I will mention it again, is the co-chair of our vaunted Canada Institute Advisory Board. That's huge. And I hope when you mentioned the Wilson Center on page 242, it was in caps, right? With big...
I think it was in caps.
Yeah, fine. So Laura's mentioned their book, The Art of Diplomacy, but what is interesting is that it really describes the real work of an ambassador couple. And the real work of an ambassador couple includes stories that range from state visits to activism to honey cake. I want to hear about that. More than anything, the book shows the importance, and everyone here believes this, of the U.S.-Canada relationship and how diplomacy, which is in short supply these days, I would say, can build bridges instead of walls. What am I talking about? So Ben is moderating this conversation about his own experiences with the Heymans, and in case you missed it, I'm sure it'll come up. There was a secret negotiation with Cuba in 2014, and it took place where? In Canada. And it led to Ben had fled by then, to normalizing relations. So welcome home, Ben, and welcome to the Heymans.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, it's great to be back here. I'm very excited to be here for a few reasons. One, I must have written over 100 introductions for Lee Hamilton at events like this in this forum. And I remember my last day at the Wilson Center, I was basically being handed off from Lee Hamilton to Barack Obama. I felt like a child being sent to summer camp or something. When Barack Obama spoke in this auditorium, and that was the speech in which he first pledged to go into Pakistan to get Osama bin Laden. So there's a lot of history for me in this auditorium and this place, which is filled with such good people. And back then, the Canada Institute was the best place for Canada and Washington. And it's also just great to be here with Bruce and Vicki, who were among our most talented ambassadors, and I say that plural because it was really two ambassadors, two for the price of one, as people once used to say, and also two of the nicest people you meet. And I guess I wanted to start. It was interesting for me as a writer. First of all, everybody should read this book. It's not like any other book you've read about diplomacy for a lot of reasons, some of which have been said and we'll talk about in terms of how you guys approached engagement. But first, I just wanted to start with the book itself, which is, it's a very unique challenge to write a book from two people, and from two perspectives, obviously as a unit, but also your individual perspectives. And I also know when you sat down with President Obama to talk about this task you're going to take on, you even kind of said either one of us could do this and be the front person. But just in terms of the book itself, I wondered, how did you both make the decision to do this together, and then how did you approach the storytelling component where you're shifting back and forth and sharing each of your voices?
You want to start with that?
So first of all, thank you for coming out today and spending a little time with us. I have to thank the Canada Institute and the Wilson Center for hosting us today. And Ben, thank you for being here. So look, we didn't come by this book naturally. This wasn't something, and I would say that's true about the ambassadorship. That wasn't something that we thought about or coveted. And we didn't go work for Barack Obama and help him on his 2 campaigns at a very significant level with any expectation in mind, none. In fact, we didn't even expect to be working for Barack Obama until we had dinner with him one night and thought he was just somebody that changed our world, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit. But it was really in the midst of this last year and a half where things had changed quite a bit in terms of the U.S.-Canada relationship, and especially relative to when we were there. And Vicki and I had explicitly taken on this role as we're going to be partners in this, and we're going to tackle this together against most State Department norms of how you operate as a couple. And in fact, the rules are so distinct of not acting as a couple that you have to figure out how to navigate that as carefully as possible and stay legal and do all the right things. And something about a fam that I learned all about.
I think those rules may not apply anymore.
But honestly, it was Simon & Schuster who came to us and said, based on what we know about your time in Ottawa and across Canada and the stories that we heard of what you and Vicki did together, and given the current state of affairs, we'd like to encourage you to take this project on. And that's when Vicki and I looked at each other and said, what? Wow. Us? And so that was a large part of the impetus. But
I would just say we're a partnership. Mm-hmm. Bruce and I have been married almost 40 years, and we met way back in university, they say in Canada, but in college at Vanderbilt University, undergrad, and then we were in business school together. And we signed up for a class. We really weren't dating. We signed up for a class in new venture creation, first semester of business school, and I knew Bruce. He was on the front row of every class, raising his hand with the answer. And I knew the answers, but I was on the back row.
I thought it was amazing that she ever thought that. I didn't know she went to classes.
Yeah. Well, long and short of it is we started at that point, and our life has always been very much a team. And, we both worked on the Obama team together and the campaigns. And when we approached the job, as you mentioned, and we had the discussion about who would lead and who would become the ambassador and how we would tackle the job, we always knew we were going to do it together. So even when we had a preliminary conversation, we said, yes, we would like to serve our country. Yes, we would like to go to Canada. So and the person that was talking to us said, well, I don't want to cause any family problems, but there's really only one ambassador. So have you worked that out? And I knew from the beginning what role for me was going to be the right role. And I'd been about bridge building, I'd been about community building, I was a creative person, and I knew I would be better outside the structure. Bruce knew would be better within. So our voices and our approaches in Canada, we were in unison, but we had different roles. And I think you'll see that in the book. Yeah. The book, we alternate chapter by chapter in narrating the chapters. Yeah. But it's not like I have a Vicki chapter and Bruce has a Bruce chapter. We appear as characters in each other's chapters because we are greatly intertwined, and it's the way in which I guess we give voice to the world that kind of creates those individual spaces. Now, my role in Canada, which I'll tell this really quick and we can go to the next question, but everybody, and first of all, I just want to say thank you to all the State Department family that's here, because there's a number of folks, Lynn, Jim, and Rich, and Romy, and a few others, yes, Tom. So I wanted to say thank you. We had, so speaking of the State Department, there's very strict, I lost my train of thought, very strict rules about what you can do and what you can't do. And the spouse or partner of the ambassador has no official role. They have no title, they have no role, they have no staff to support them, they just are there. So before we came to Canada, I said to Bruce, listen, we got here as a team, I'm here to serve my country and I'm here to work and I'm gonna work. So I'm just gonna bring up my own chief of staff with me, I funded it, and I just set up a little shingle at our home, Lorenado, and started working in the community. And the fortunate news was I was really beautifully supported by the people in the State Department. I mean, I'm sure at first it was a little terrorizing. They were probably like, oh my God, what is this woman doing? She's setting up shop. I don't know what's going to happen. But I really didn't weigh in on policy. I weighed in on the human things that connect us: environment, identity, social justice, assimilation, race, the things that are human elements that connect us really through the artist's voice, and we used art. So anyway, long and short of it is I didn't really have a title, so I thought my title would just become, it was not going to be the wife of the ambassador, and it wasn't going to be Mrs. Heyman. That was my mother-in-law. So I took on this role of a cultural envoy, but then I was informed by the State Department that I couldn't be an envoy because that was
That's
an official position,
thing, yeah.
but I could be an envoy with a little e.
Little e.
So
take the big E, turn it to a little e.
So that's really
Yeah.
what happened. So I think you'll see in the book that it was only made sense for us to do it together as a team because we got there as a team, we worked as a team, and we're known in Canada as a team, and it's like a yin and a yang, and it presents a whole.
Yeah. Well, I also was interested, what you really do is you paint a picture of the fact that diplomacy is a very multifaceted endeavor, that there's the diplomacy that people are used to seeing, which is leaders shaking hands and communiques and agreements, but the engagement that takes place in a foreign country is not just with the government of that country, but with the people of that country. And I was wondering, when you went into this role together, how you were thinking about approaching your jobs in a way that encompassed that broader engagement with society and with the arts and with culture, as well as with the business community and the government. How did you think of the role of an ambassador in a country like Canada that is a close friend of ours, that has so many links? What was essentially your philosophy, and how did that work in practice of the two of you dividing and, I don't want to say conquering, because
we don't conquer.
we don't conquer Canada.
Conquer.
Dividing and engaging.
Dividing and
Engaging,
engaging.
yes.
So we literally set priorities, at least priorities that we were able to set as a result of being here in Washington for a long period of time, because you may not have realized it, but Republicans and Democrats didn't get along as well, and the confirmation process took a little longer than anybody had anticipated. But it gave me a lot of time to spend time here in this town and actually do a lot of meetings, getting educated on the Canada file, as people would say. So in doing that, we set a set of priorities. First was trade. So number one was trade, largest trading partner, most complex trading partner, et cetera. The second we set was energy and the environment. And for us, it was important to marry energy and the environment together, which, it's not energy or the environment. The third was culture and cultural outreach, which I made very clear this was going to be Vicki's bucket, and she was going to take and drive, but we left it open to go in a number of different directions. The fourth was international engagement. So the international engagement that we would do, whether it's through NATO, or whether it's through G7, or whether it's through actually working with Canada to accomplish a lot of things that the U.S. had a difficult time accomplishing on our own, where Canada could be a voice in helping us navigate things, or even providing a platform for Cuban negotiations, or different things. I added a fifth once I got to Canada, and that fifth was something that I didn't fully appreciate as an American, but it turns out it probably is the most important thing to the Canadians, and that was the border and the functioning of the border. Because as we traveled around the country, every time we brought something up, what's important? As long as that border works and as long as it operates, and the border is a larger issue, how the airports operate and how effective it is on pre-clearance, the 117 border crossings that we have in this 5,525-mile border. So we set all those priorities up, and then we began to set, strategy and tactics for each of those. And then Vicki developed her own stream out in culture, and it really, the platform that was the launching point was the Art and Embassies program, that is a really important program in the State Department and never should be underestimated or undervalued. It was started by John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, and Vicki took that, and you can talk about it, but you took that and you morphed it from just hanging beautiful U.S. art on the walls of the embassy and the residence too.
Yeah, too.
Yeah. Well, no, I was going to ask you, Vicki. I mean, because one of the things that's so interesting in the book is that people might think of cultural and arts as, you know, you have some events, but you had a strategy behind
Yeah.
it. Why don't you talk a little bit about what
you're talking about how do you connect to people across the country. So, during the campaign years, which everybody, there's some of the Obama family here too, everybody's familiar with, we had a model called the snowflake model. And basically it was an idea about engaging different groups of people around an idea. The idea was the election of this incredible man, or the re-election of this incredible man with a vision for our country. And we deployed that in the campaign, and you were at the center of the snowflake, and you would find the nuclei, and they would create their own snowflakes, and exponentially you would grow. So in the book, we refer to this model, we kind of renamed it the hive model, which is pretty much the same. You think about a beehive and the hexagonal cells, and you start small, and the cells support each other, and you glom onto different groups of people and just exponentially spread and create collective energy. So I really set up the structure of how I was going to navigate Canada very similar to a campaign. I use culture as a foundation, and we had an opportunity to travel Canada like none other. When we arrived, we started in Ottawa, but within the first 6 weeks, we had visited I think we'd visited all 7 provinces and 21.
Not all, they're all.
We visited seven provinces, and we had maybe gone to 21 cities. And so every place we went, I would really zone in. That's my passion, and that was my purpose, was culture, and using culture as a way to meet people. So I would meet with the people at the Art Institute. I would go into local community art centers. I would go to the ballet. I would look at social innovation incubators. I would go to those places, to schools, meet youth. And I used these kind of different spaces to grow a web. And I did a lot of research. Like, I figured out who I should meet as influencers in those spaces in every single place we went. And we would divide up a lot. I would go into this culture space, and Bruce would go into the political space, the business commerce space, and we kind of come back together till we had this really wonderful group of very full-bodied people. And it wasn't just going and meeting them and saying hi, but it was actually managing and investing in authentic relationships with those people.
Yeah. Then we bring them together.
And bring
the business people and the political people together with the arts and culture, and then create this dynamic conversation of tackling the issues that Vicki brought up. You could tackle conversations around race, around environment, around sexual orientation, around things that are challenging sometimes to just talk about and don't naturally come up in a political space.
We created in Ottawa with the National Gallery of Canada, the U.S. Embassy in Arts and Embassy, a program called Contemporary Conversations. And the idea of Contemporary Conversations was to bring in the top social impact artists from the United States to Canada in partnership with the National Gallery and create these great dialogues. So we brought in artists like the Astor Gates, Nick Cave, Eric Fischel, Kiki Smith, and we would have each of them kind of with a different genre of conversation. And we created a real brand around Contemporary Conversations, and that brand became well known. Yeah. And once we started the brand in Ottawa, when Dale Chihuly or Leslie Hewitt was in Toronto, I traveled there. When there was someone extraordinary in Calgary or Vancouver, I traveled there. If it was a music award show. So we really took on a space where we were known in culture, and it wasn't just showing up, but it was having those conversations about the impact that culture carrier was.
And at a time when identity was a key issue.
Yeah.
Right.
And identity was one of the chief things we focused on, because at that time that was, and it still is today, there was a lot of issues around identity in Canada with Indigenous rights and other topics like that.
Well, and on the government side, I did just, we'll get into specific issues, but you go up at a time when Stephen Harper is still Prime Minister, wasn't particularly happy with us over Keystone. But you saw Stephen Harper and then Justin Trudeau, and I wonder if you could just give us, I think people are always curious about what are these people actually like in person. What were your impressions of them as people, Harper and Trudeau, and what was it like having to deal with the whiplash or the seesaw of moving from a conservative government to a liberal government early in your tenure like that?
So first of all, I'm glad I went in the order that I did.
That's true.
Let's just start with that. Stephen Harper was a quiet a man who kept to himself quite a bit. He was not out in the public. He didn't engage in the community nearly anything like what we had experienced with Obama or a lot of other leaders. For many big, large social events, his wife might show up either alone or with a member of the cabinet. And he didn't particularly have a sense of humor that he displayed. He was kind of a stiff,
Very diplomatic.
Yeah, right.
Of you, I mean.
Exactly.
I was going to say, really?
And very determined. And he very much controlled his cabinet. He, told them what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and nobody really had a lot of license to operate independently without a lot of clearance from the Prime Minister's office. To say he was focused on Keystone would be the largest understatement of the planet. I mean, he went out and bought billboards in subways, here, in the train stations, in the airport, advertising Canada and the Canada relationship and promoting, you guys got to approve this pipeline for us model. And they really, day one when I arrived, this was a focus for him. And we can come back to that in a minute. But look, there was only so much an ambassador could do on Keystone at that point, as all of you know. In fact, I was told not even to bring up a word because, and do no media around it, really just let the process do its thing. So that frustration, ended up, keeping what I would consider to be a chilly initial relationship. And that is also an understatement as you'll read the book. The second was, Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau is about the exact opposite of Stephen Harper. If you can just check almost every box of what you care about, what you think about, how you act personally, how you get energy from being around crowds of people and engaging with people and being at events and town halls and doing all these things. So they are literally like night and day, or winter versus summer. And that transition was an uplifting one, actually, because at that time, it just depends. If you have a conservative government and a Republican president here, you tend to find a lot more in common of what you believe in. And if you have a liberal leader and a Democratic president here, you'll find a lot more in common. But we were able to do something unique. If you don't mind, I'd like to tell everybody this, because I think it would be important for everyone here to get a sense of what we did, which I think was a little, at least I was told at the time, was unique. So those of you who are familiar with embassies around the world, in the embassies you have representatives of various parts of the U.S. government. Larger embassies have more of those than smaller embassies. And you go around and you might have someone from Homeland Security, someone from the FBI, someone from the Agricultural Department, et cetera, and you work around. So when we were approaching the election that was taking place in Canada, I basically went and told each person around my country team that I wanted you to work with your counterpart back in Washington and set 3 priorities that you'd like to get accomplished. And I'd like you to stand up in front of the group in just, it was about 2 months' time or 8 weeks' time. And you're going to present to each other. So everybody had to go work with their counterpart back in Washington, set goals and priorities for the new government, and then everybody stood up and shared with each other what all the goals were for every department. We then created a master document of this. And I then said, well, I want to make sure I'm going to Washington. I want to do that in Washington. And they said, well, that's not the way we do this in Washington. I said, well, how do you do it in Washington? Well, if you want to have a meeting with the Commerce Department, we'll set that up, and you, Mr. Ambassador, you'll go to the Commerce Department. If you want to have a meeting at the White House, you just go to the White House. I said, well, no. How do I get everybody on the same page, just like we did at the embassy? And they said, there isn't a natural structure to actually pull that off. I said, well, we're going to do it anyway. And we did. And through a combination of the NSC and representatives from every matching group that took place, we then went through all of the priorities for every department together in that room. What ended up happening as a result of that was, I think, for a unique moment in time, all of Washington and Ottawa were exactly on the same page of all the priorities that we wanted to get accomplished. And the good news is, once a government came into place, we knew exactly, when we were having all of our first meetings with every minister, we knew exactly what we wanted to talk about with every minister that was coming in. Secondly, the White House then became very clear as to what all those goals and priorities were. And it was very quickly thereafter, people asked, how did that state visit actually take place? And it was really like 6 weeks after the election, we provided an invitation to the Prime Minister to come. That was the first state dinner, which happened March 10th. First state dinner between the Canada and the U.S. in nearly 20 years for a Prime Minister. I then also, during that process, and one last thing, and then I'll turn it over back to you. In the embassy in Ottawa, when you walk in on the top floor, there are quotes from 2 Republican and 2 Democratic presidents about the importance of the U.S.-Canada relationship. And every day as ambassador, I'd come in and walk by and look at those quotes and literally stop a minute and take those quotes in. And I thought, wouldn't that be amazing if we could get a quote up here for Barack Obama somewhere in this building? And so when I sat down with then the principal secretary for the Prime Minister, I said to him, so, we got the state dinner. What do you think the odds are that you guys would really welcome Barack Obama in to speak before Parliament? I think he almost fell out of his chair. He says, are you kidding me? Like, I can't promise you that's what the Prime Minister would, but if we could pull that off, we would be all in. So then, of course, I called the White House and said, the Canadians really want Barack Obama to come in and speak, and that's one of the criteria that they want to get done at the state dinner in our bilateral meeting. It's really important to the Canadians that the Prime Minister, that the President come and speak. And so I did this dance between the two, back and forth, for a while. And so finally, toward the end, as we were agreeing on the final strokes of what we were going to agree at the state dinner, which isn't always a state dinner under the Obama world, it was lots of things need to get done if you're coming here for a state dinner. We're going to have a lot of announcements. And one of those was an invitation being presented by the Prime Minister to the President to come to speak before Parliament. And of course, I'm sitting there in the Oval Office, as you've been in many times, but I'm sitting there watching that ask take place, which was one of the highlights for me personally, to go, yep, that's good. And he said yes, and there we are. And so for the first time in more than 20 years, a president spoke before Parliament. And I then turned to the team in the building and I said, let's take his speech. I want all of us to sit down. What are the most memorable lines to all of you? And we took them and we engraved them in the wall.
And the line is?
Well, the lines about this great border we have that we don't have to worry about defending or doing anything with. And I hope people are looking at that very carefully these days because there's a lot of stress. But that gives you a sense of this transition. Yeah. I told you about the transition of the 2 different leaders. But we actually did a lot of work to accomplish something very special that happened once Justin Trudeau came in. Because, the window of time was kind of short,
Well, one of the issues that was so complicated was energy and the environment, as you said. It had been dominated by Keystone. I think sometimes Americans don't fully appreciate the complexity of the energy issue in Canada. It's so central to the economy, particularly in Western Canada. And yet we really needed Canada and all of our closest friends to be more ambitious to get the Paris Agreement done. I wonder, what was it like to navigate the politics of energy and the environment in Canada as you saw that transition from Harper to Trudeau to someone who cared more about the environment, wanted to be a constructive partner on Paris, but also had very serious economic interests, particularly in Western Canada, that were somewhat resistant to action on climate change. What was your window into the Canadian approach to energy and the environment, and how do you think it was that we worked with them to get a more ambitious Paris commitment?
So I think what ended up happening was, Canadians in general are much more environmentally aware, probably because they have the second largest landmass country in the world with only 37 million people, and they're mainly urban, but they care about this environment so much and protecting of it, and very significant amount of the fresh water of the planet exists in Canada, and they have indigenous input as well. But Stephen Harper coming from, and his wife, and he coming from the not only conservative base, but coming from out west, and at least most recently out west, and he represented that oil interest, and that was his number one priority, and he was really focused on trying to figure out a way to get this additional pipeline out. And you can only go four ways. You go north, south, east, or west, and he couldn't get it done domestically, so his best shot at this was to get it done through the United States. I will tell you, as a bit of side story, which you'll also see in the book, and that is 1 week in being ambassador, our administration made the decision to not make the decision on Keystone and to wait for the Nebraska Supreme Court. So Secretary Kerry, and we're sitting there standing by. It's Good Friday. By the way, this was not one of my better Fridays. But Good Friday, Secretary Kerry is calling then Foreign Minister Baird, who is traveling in the Mideast. And I guess he either didn't communicate it as clearly or there was a connection broken, but he had to call 3 times to communicate we were not going to do Keystone right now. Not that we weren't doing it, but we were going to do it right now.
Yeah.
So about 10 o'clock on Friday night, Good Friday, I get a phone call from my good friend, Mr. Sanders, who's here, right there, who is my deputy in Ottawa. And he says, sir, the government has requested your presence. When? Like first thing in the morning. Easter weekend? Yes. You're being called in by the Canadian government. Wow, does this happen? I don't think so, not here. So I called, of course, the State Department, and they said, we don't recall that ever happening. Look, we had a dialogue the next day. It wasn't so bad, but things froze out for me in town, which were a message back to Washington how important this was. But the bottom line is, how do we navigate that? This was existential for the Prime Minister. And every little twist and turn that might have delayed this in any way, shape, or form, or taking it down a bad path, sent he and his team into a really bad place. Where the opposite was, we didn't announce the decision in Keystone until after the election.
Yeah.
Told Justin Trudeau's team, and they go, we're really disappointed. We're sorry to hear that. Now let's move on and let's get some things done.
Phone call with Justin.
And so it was not the same. And then we worked right away to jump on Paris.
Yeah.
And then I would say his team was very focused on the environment and willing to do the Arctic deals that we ended up doing, and non-drilling in the Arctic and preserving the Arctic and those things. So this is, again, I call it in the book like 2 seasons, winter and summer, but night and day, completely different governments. But let me say one thing, because I can't help myself. Even in light of the disagreement that we might have had on Keystone, on how this was done, there was never an issue of an existential threat to the U.S.-Canada relationship. That, I believe the U.S.-Canada relationship always stayed supreme for regardless of Republican or Democrat or conservative or liberal, whoever occupied Ottawa or Washington. But I think the behavior that is taking place these last 2 years has crossed a number of lines and put a lot of stress on this relationship.
Well, and we'll go to the audience in a moment here, but Vicki, I want to ask you about what it was. We talked about a Canadian transition. You're obviously, helping to manage this embassy, and also, you have your own personal views, in reading in the book, it's so interesting to think about experiencing this transition where it's election night in the United States in 2016. You're kind of watching in public and then kind of retreating in private, and then you're there through this transition where you're still representing a set of policies that, and a set of approaches on cultural diplomacy and identity and refugees that you sense are going to change. What was it like to be in this kind of limbo state between the election and the inauguration, when you guys are preparing to leave a very meaningful experience for you, but also seeing this change happening around you?
I think, well, we were very destabilized, obviously, as many people were with the results of the election, and we really weren't expecting the Trump victory. And I think we, like many people in the United States, were just very disappointed, but still held out some hope that everything that we'd worked on was not going to be totally squelched. And, I didn't like the demeanor of Mr. Trump. I didn't agree with his vision for the world. I was not a fan, but I was sitting there in the State Department, and we, by law, could have no engagement or make any overture politically in the community or in the country about our feelings. So I, during the election, tried to hold it inside. But I would say that once we knew he was going to be the president, we were going through these conversations about if there was a period of time and the president had asked, President Trump had asked that for continuity's sake, Bruce remain in the seat, would we be willing to do that? And that was a very tough decision for me personally, because I felt like there was never a day during our tenure, or really during the entire Obama era, where I was disappointed in the president. I was so proud of the things we accomplished. I was so proud of him as a leader and as a person. And Bruce was the personal representative for the president in that role. And I thought to myself, how can you represent a set of values that you don't adhere to, or a vision for your country that you don't believe in? And Bruce and I kind of went through this back and forth, because he said, I'm here, this continuity, it could be a national security issue, it could really help us moving forward. And actually, Vice President Biden came to visit at the very end of the tenure. There was a surprise state dinner for President Biden in
Vice President
Biden. Oh, there's a slip.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh.
Vice President Biden. Oh, maybe karma. I don't know. There was a surprise state dinner for Vice President Biden, and on the car ride to the state dinner, Canadian state dinner, we had this conversation with the Vice President, and Bruce said, "Listen, we're really struggling with this. Like, would you stay? Given what we know, would you stay?" And he says, "Well, I'm going to tell you two things. First, you're not going to be asked to stay.
Yeah.
And secondly, if you are, you should stay. You should stay because you should try to hold on and hope for a better day." Well, there was Bruce then.
He was right.
At that point, Bruce had sent a letter to the Trump transition team that went unanswered. It's still unanswered to today, or today. Would you like me to stay? I have information. Would you like some continuity? Nothing. So obviously, we packed up, we left. And at the end, 3 or 4 days after we got back home, it was right after the inauguration, I remember sitting in my home, it was late in the evening, and the Muslim ban was instituted. And I thought, what if I was sitting there right now in Canada? How would you adhere to that? Yeah. How could you be in that
after
seat?
Trudeau had done all this.
And so that a tweet came from Trudeau within minutes, Canada's open for business, diversity is our strength, there's a home here for you. And I thought that's the kind of leadership that I was used to at home, and that's what I really admired there. So it was an interesting time. I don't think anyone ever expected the acceleration and the deterioration of the relationship in the way the way it came about.
Well, I want to make sure we get to audience questions here. I want to make sure we talk about the USMCA. I want to make sure I get these acronyms right now. It's not AFTA anymore. But folks in the audience might have interest in that too. So why don't we open up for questions down here? There's mics that'll come your way. So there's a. Oh wait, whoa.
Jane
well,
Armin?
there's a chairman's or president's prerogative here that Jane can take.
You didn't mention Cuba.
Yeah.
Maybe it's classified, but if it's not, it would be very interesting to hear how this came about.
I defer to Ben.
Well, yeah, because it started in 2013, and it's a good statement about allies, this is a value of allies. It's something that Bruce and Vicki talk about in the book. But essentially, we wanted to set up this back channel with Cuba. So we initiated a contact secretly to the Cuban government saying, would you be engaged in a discussion with me as a representative of President Obama? And they put forward Alejandro Castro, the son of Raul Castro. So we knew they were serious about what they want to do. So then the question becomes, well, where do you meet? Because we couldn't have Alejandro Castro just flying up here to Washington. I couldn't just go to Cuba. And so who's our closest friend in the neighborhood? It's Canada. And it was Harper at the time. So even, at your point, even though that relationship was sometimes chilly, we could call them and say, we want to initiate a back channel with the Cubans. We'd like a venue. We can't really tell you what we're talking about, but we're trying to improve relations. And they said, sure, we'll set it all up. And I went up probably 11 times to Canada between the summer of 2013 and the announcement at the end of 2014. I would land at the airport in Ottawa, be met by a very friendly Canadian security guy who'd take me, put me in a car, drive me for an hour and a half to a lake house outside of Ottawa, the Wilson House, which is not the same Wilson. John Hannaford, who became the kind of the national security advisor of Goldman for Trudeau, was the host essentially. He would set this up, put us in a room, and never ask any questions. You know, and again, like think about that. An ally who just says, "We'll host you. We'll make it. We'll find excuses to bring the Cubans up here. We won't really ask you what you're doing. You can use our venue. We want to support this in any way." We couldn't have done it without Canada. It would have been literally impossible to do the Vatican got a lot of credit, rightfully, but Canada actually played a more indispensable role at the beginning than the Vatican did. And I think it really does speak to alliances, and it speaks also to Canada's ability to have a good relationship with Cuba and the United States. They have a more complicated and interesting foreign policies than sometimes people realize. I did feel like I was worrying on my welcome, so we decided to meet at a hotel, airport hotel in Toronto. And the first time we did that, 2 Russian spies tailed me through the lobby of the hotel and took pictures of me throughout it. And then I decided we'll go back to yes, but and you were there when we announced it on December 17th, and Obama called Harper to thank him. Well, we'll go to the question over here.
First of all, thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you.
As ambassador and co-ambassador, I'll say it, for this country. It's truly, the book is great. I read the book yesterday, and it's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here to hear you talk. It's hard to believe a lot of things today, but it's hard to believe that we're talking about issues with Canada, who's our oldest ally and historically our oldest trade partner. My question to you is this: under the current administration, how much damage do you think is being done to our longstanding relationship with Canada and other countries, for that matter? And more importantly, how do we find our way back?
So, if you have a wound, and it's a flesh wound, it doesn't take very long to heal. The deeper the wound, the longer it takes to heal. Sometimes it can even look healed on the outside and you still feel a lot of pain. In the U.S.-Canada relationship in particular, but I would say this is true with all of our friends around the world, the relationship's based on trust. And when you break that trust, whether you do it in your personal life, in a spouse or a partner, whether you do it in the business world, when you break that bond of trust, it takes a really long time to build trust back. Trust is accumulated and built over a lot of experiences and time and can be diminished really fast in some set of bad decisions. This is an accumulation. This is not just, this is how we negotiate just to get an outcome. Because if it was just that, we would have been focused on just one thing. But this is comprehensive in the way this is happening. Whether it's steel and aluminum tariffs, or whether it's the Northwest Passage this week, or whether it's Cuba and what's happened and not knowing Canada full well, who had been helpful to us in the history of this whole relationship, but now squeezing them hard on potential litigation. Whether it's China, and now they're in a deep box on China. I think there's something else that's happening here, if you don't mind, and I think it's also probably will impact our allies as well. That for the longest time, the United States was out as a multilateralist working on promoting liberal democracy, small l, small d, liberal democracy in the world. And we had allies and partners doing that. One of our best partners in doing that was Canada, always there with us doing this, promoting this. And Canada could take the tip of the spear a bit and be a bit more aggressive and play at a level that is much higher than a country of its economic size and population size because of this partnership and relationship. But now Canada is without that partner we now are much more isolationist and not promoting these things. So Canada goes out and promotes those same values that we had talked about with women's rights and the issue with now Saudi Arabia, and now Saudi Arabia, boom, retaliates in that way they have. Now we have a legal obligation with the United States and Canada on extradition. But because the U.S. has pulled back, I think China has given kind of a pass to go in and take swipes at our next door neighbor and friend. And so, look, I think that it's also a defining moment for our allies. In this case, Canada. What role are they going to play in the world without the U.S. by their side, promoting the things that they value so much? And how do you do that? So I think that it's a lot more complicated than it may appear. And I only tell you that the wound is there. It's getting deeper as we continue to do things that you want to scratch your head and say, seriously, you had to go to the Arctic Council? The Arctic Council to sit down and start taking, and I participated in these Arctic Council meetings when the U.S. was chair, and the language and style that we used, and seeing that and what was the purpose of that, I think that was a pretty hostile move on our part. And so I think the pains are going to be there. And I'll just say one last thing, and I know you're standing here. President Obama had a rating of like close to 90% approval rating when we left. Donald Trump this week has an approval rating of 10% positive approval rating in Canada. And the United States of America has an approval rating of in the 30s. Okay? This is the lowest rating how Canadians have felt about our country in the history of the polling of our two countries. And so we have work to do, and we need to understand our behaviors, which are consuming us in the media and consuming this town, are impacting our international relations, and there will be a price to pay long beyond when we have a new administration and a new government and a new approach, and when we show back up and say, hey, it's us again, we're back, I think we're going to have to do a lot more work.
May I say one thing? We've been in Canada for the last almost 2 weeks, and we launched the book a week ago Tuesday, and we've been going city to city. We were in Toronto, Kingston, and Ottawa, and we're heading out west next week. And it's pervasive, the disappointment. It's palpable, the way Canadians feel about where we are.
Hurt. They're really hurt.
They're hurt. They are kind of in disbelief. And it's almost like a mourning process. Like you're not the people that we knew before. So part of our reason, you talk about the book, I mean, part of the reason we're going on this tour and part of the reason we wrote the book is that we're a little bit stuck until 2020, and we may be, we could potentially be stuck after 2020. So what do we do about this? So we talk about the role of citizen ambassador, and that's what Bruce and I really are now, that we are citizen ambassadors with a small a. So I think the book is a call to action. It gives you an opportunity to get into the hearts and minds and the land of Canada. There's incredible stories about people all over this country. And we as Americans have a responsibility really to get to know our neighbor and want to know them at a deeper level. And then use your power to be a citizen ambassador. So whether you're
All of you.
whether you're a writer, whether you're an artist, whether you're a you know, an activist or an organizer, like, this relationship is worth fighting for. So how are we going to get back? We're only going to get back if we participate, if we advocate for a friend, and if we vote. And I think we have to show the world that this administration has roughed up, that we, the people, have not abandoned them. And I think that is the purpose. And the conversations we're having in different spaces in Canada are a bit different than we're having here. So, you know, it's somewhat consoling and decoding for Canadians. But for us here, it's the opportunity to get the book into the world and to see in a very human way who the people are, what this power of culture and breaking bread together and really getting into the heart of each other and having these authentic shared experiences can do for our bilateral relationship. So that's kind of what I would think.
Bruce, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for everything you do. Ben, thanks for being such a rock star. Half of the staff of the Wilson Center are waiting to have you sign their book, apparently. Something about pods save the world. I don't know. I'm old.
Out there.
Thank you all for coming. We've got a reception. We've got a book signing, so you're going to have time to speak to these wonderful folks one-on-one. Thank you to Jane Harmon for opening and being such a fan of the Canada-U.S. relationship. We really appreciate it. Of course, we've got the staff. We've got the team. We've got Mariana Sanchez and Jackie Orr. We've got the indefatigable Lauren Eiton, who's been running these folks for the last several weeks. Our AV team, Tracy and Treon. And we have one more quote from the book. I think more true words were never said about the relationship. Bruce Heyman says, "We all need more Canada, but right about now, I think we all need a drink."
That's a true quote in the book.